Asher
find it.
ha'amim v'natan lanu et torato.
Baruch atah Adonai noten haTorah.
So today we've got a wonderful chapter to unpack. It's the last of the depression chapters. It's the chapter about LBJ. And the pivot to Torah, I think, is extremely rich and generative. So let me just start by inviting people to share their thoughts about this chapter. What did you think of Doris Kearns Goodwin's chapter on LBJ and on his depressions, plural? And what emerged for you from that chapter?
This one, right? No. Why are you on Facebook?
Linda Leffler, good to see you again.
Okay, well, I looked it over this morning from the perspective of the questions that asked.
Let me just invite everybody, if you're not speaking, to mute yourself so that we don't all hear ambient noise. So if you're not speaking, please mute yourself. And then when you want to speak, we'll be very eager to hear you. So Linda Leffert, you're speaking.
Okay, so I looked it over this morning with the lens of the questions that you posed about the reaction to a difficulty or a depression. And what it said, and I don't know how that relates to the Bible part of it, but it occurred to me that when he lost the election in the Senate, he felt it was a referendum on his self-worth.
Right.
That it was a result of what he did or didn't do or couldn't do. We'll discuss the details later. Big difference is that the heart attack was something that happened to him. He didn't, I mean, maybe he, we all don't have the best, safest health habits maybe, but basically it was something that happened not because of, it wasn't a referendum in any way on him as a person or his decisions. It's just something that happened. And in that situation, he was able to deal with it and in a different way. And I think it's because one was something that was his fault, quote unquote, to slightly simplify it. And the other was not the fault of anything. If going to clarify the difference between the two.
Okay, thank you, Linda. Right, so one was he lost an election and query whether that happened to him or that was something he brought about. But clearly the heart attack just happened to him. One of the takeaways is, this book, this chapter comes in the context where we've read about Lincoln's depression, FDR's depression, Teddy Roosevelt's depression. And at the first blush, I wanted to ask you your reactions to the fact that, Lincoln had no money and no education and no family support and couldn't support himself and, couldn't marry Mary Todd because he felt he couldn't earn a living. That was why he was depressed. And Teddy Roosevelt loses his mother and his wife on the same day. That was why he was depressed. And FDR, who is so active and running and jumping and agile and athletic, gets polio and can never walk again. And that's why he's depressed. And then LBJ loses an election. And that's his first depression. Then the heart attack comes later, obviously. Here's my question. What was your reaction to the fact that the way she sets it up, his losing an election is as a prompt for depression and is so in some way put at the same level as losing a wife and a mother, as contracting polio, as being dirt poor. Well, how did you react to the apparent asymmetry of the event that gave rise to the depression? Anyone? Connie, if you could unmute.
He had nothing else in his life. He had no other interests. He was not. He wasn't interested in art. He wasn't interested in music. There was nothing for him to turn to. So I don't think he saw a way to go on after he lost the election. I don't think he saw his life as worthy to go on.
Right. And I think that's right. And he famously conducted interviews with reporters while he was defecating. He's so busy and so political and so right that then there was literally no private time. There was no borderline. There was no boundary. While he's going to the bathroom, he's talking about affairs of state with reporters, right? And in that kind of world, losing the election was so consequential. It strikes me that it evokes the teaching from Proverbs that every heart knows its own sorrow, meaning that for somebody reading it, for the reader reading it, you would say losing an election doesn't feel like it's as serious as losing your mother and losing your wife in the same day. It doesn't feel like it's as serious as losing your physical health and getting polio and you can't walk anymore. It doesn't feel like it's as serious, but every heart knows its own bitterness. For LBJ, this was a devastating loss. Now, one of the things that she draws out, and this will connect us to our Torah piece, is how the two different depressions resulted in very different transformations. After the election, he becomes very self-centered and focuses on his money and business, etc. And then, of course, after the heart attack, on supporting the vulnerable. Any thoughts or comments about that? What was your reaction to that aspect of her treatment? That he responded so very differently to the two depressive episodes. Anyone? And let me, oh, by the way, who is, Caitlin, are you hosting us? I'm not sure. Who's hosting from Temple Emmanuel?
Sean.
Sean. So please, if you would like, thank you, Sean. And if you would like to ask me a question and I can't see you, send a comment in the chat room, and then Sean can call on you, or I'll see it in the chat room if you would like to, because I might not be able to see everybody. So any comments on LBJ's very different responses to these two depressive episodes? Dottie. And then if you can unmute, please, Dottie. Dottie, if you can unmute. Thank you. Now we can start. You got to unmute, Dottie. Now you're muted. If you can unmute. Dottie, if you can please unmute.
Now, okay?
Now.
Okay.
Now.
No, well, the first comment was, I wanted to ask you this morning, does every president go through depression? These four men, they were all basically brilliant. They knew what they wanted, and they went through hell and high water to get it. But LBJ was less able to accept a defeat. And I think, as Connie said, that no sports, no outside interest. But he pulled himself up by the strap boots from a poor beginning and all that. And his desire was to be in the Congress, but he could not accept the fact of what happened. But then he realized when he ran again that you don't post. I don't know how they do things in Texas, East Texas, South Texas. You don't say ahead, I have won.
Right.
You wait till everybody has cast their ballot. But I think that I didn't realize the extent of his ability. It's just that he had so much ability, but it had to be the way that he wanted, and he was in a rush. In 2 days, he proposed to Lady Bird. I mean, this is what he wanted, and this is what
right.
he got. And then he went on to make millions of dollars.
Right. He was a man on a mission. Yeah. I just want to build on the first part, and I mean, it's very interesting to read these as historical figures, but we're not in a adult ed history class with a synagogue. And I want to just say, I think that they're also human beings. They're also men. And I think, to me, what these four profiles of depression suggests is the virtual universality of depression. That is to say, if you are alive, and if you're a sentient being, and if you care, you're going to have an interior landscape that is a lot like New England weather. There are going to be some cloudy days. There's going to be some rainy days. There's going to be some overcast days. And what I take from this is it's not, I mean, they happen to have been extraordinarily talented, driven leaders who become president of the United States. But I think they're also, the power of this piece of her book is the universality of an interior life that is shaded and complicated and complex and nuanced, and how, along with depression, serious depression, comes serious resilience and serious reemergence in all of their cases. And so I wanted to I want to pivot now. If anybody wants to say anything else about LBJ, by all means, but I wanted to pivot now to the universal aspect of depression and interior landscape that is a lot like New England weather, to talk about Isaac in our reading this week. And so feel free anytime to chime in, but what I'm offering you today and what I sent you yesterday is the sources that are in a remarkable and a remarkably poignant commentary of the late Rabbi Sachs. I think this was Rabbi Sachs's last commentary on Toldot, which is the reading of this week. And let me just outline it for you, big picture, and then we'll look inside, okay? He looks at Isaac, and he offers a psychological interpretation of Isaac. And here's what he says. He says that Isaac goes through a traumatic event. We read the Akedah so much, it becomes like wallpaper and we don't see it. But if you just pause to imagine what it would be like for your father to bind you up and take a knife to your neck, ready to slaughter you. That's pretty traumatic. And what Rabbi Sachs argues, and his piece is the last piece in your packet. But what I provided you is it before that the Torah passages that he relies on. What he argues is that Isaac goes through a serious depression, not unlike LBJ, FDR, Teddy Roosevelt, and Abraham Lincoln. Isaac goes through a serious depression. And he argues that there are three cases where you would expect to see Isaac, but Isaac is missing, where Isaac is not an actor in his own life. And that suggests that for some period of time, Isaac is disabled and he is unable to make do. And then what he's going to argue is that Isaac does a move that, so you have the depression, you have the disabled quality, the sidelined quality, the hamstrung quality, the absent quality, the not engaged in his own life quality. And then you have the resilience. So without further ado, if you'll look at your sources, what I'm going to actually have you do is look first on page 4 of the handout. This is going to point to the 3 silences where you would expect Isaac to be, but according to Rabbi Sachs, may he rest in peace, Isaac is so depressed that he can't participate in his own life. Here's the first one. The first one is at the very tail end of the binding of Isaac story, right? That is to say, Abraham has dropped the knife and they've offered the ram instead. And then verse 19, this is the end of the story, the last sentence of the story, the last sentence of the binding of Isaac story. Verse 19, Abraham then returned to his servants, and they departed together for Beersheba, and Abraham stayed in Beersheba. And who's not mentioned? Isaac. So Isaac is missing from the end of the story of the of the binding of Isaac, right? And if you read the story, this is well known. It says 3 different times that father and son went up together. Vayalchu shnehem yachdav. Abraham and Isaac go up together. Abraham and Isaac go up together. Abraham and Isaac go up together. And then at the very end, the last line Vayashav Avraham el Na'arav. Abraham then returned to his servants. And it says nothing about Isaac. It doesn't say Isaac chose to remain alone. It just says nothing about him. So that's going to be the first silence. Where is Isaac? At the end of the story of the binding of Isaac. Let me pause. Any thoughts, comments, questions? But that's going to be the first point where Rabbi Sachs says, this guy has got a serious case of depression. Anybody want to, any comments? And again, text or chat with Sean if you would like to share. Just want to make sure that I'm calling on anybody who would like to be called on. Okay, let's look at the second silence. So Isaac is not present at the end of the story of the binding of Isaac. Look on page 5 of the handout. Okay, Sarah dies. You know, Sarah died in Kiryat Arba in the land of Canaan, and Abraham proceeded to mourn for Sarah and to bewail her. Then Abraham rose from beside his dead and spoke to the Hittites, saying, you know, that's when Abraham buys the burial plot. And one of the things that Rabbi Sachs points out is that who is the primary mourner when somebody dies? The primary mourner are the children, right? The primary mourner for Sarah should have been Isaac, but Isaac is not even mentioned in the context of his mother's funeral. He is silent. He is absent. He is not mentioned. The only mourner that's mentioned is Abraham. And of course, a spouse mourns for a spouse. But Sarah was not only a spouse to Abraham, she was a mother to Isaac, and Isaac is not mentioned whatsoever. Again, Rabbi Sachs's interpretation, he is so depressed, he's just withdrawn from life. He's not present at his mother's funeral. Questions, thoughts, comments? Okay, let's go to the third one. This is Rabbi Sachs's third silence. We're on page 6.
Wes?
Yes, please.
Yeah,
Paul.
I want to, yeah. I think I'm going to be, I'm already sorry for what I'm going to say.
Say it anyway.
Yeah, okay.
I'm grateful for any words.
Okay,
Great.
because I believe this is an overinterpretation. And, you know, the words as written were not written by Abraham. They were written by someone else. So that person is already making an interpretation that may or may not be true, just by the omission. Frequently, when we write letters or we write papers, we don't put in everything that we think.
Fair enough, Paul. But the person who writes this, and you know, we could agree to disagree theologically. Who writes it? Does God write it?
Right.
Does Moses write it? Does the biblical writer? We'll just say whoever wrote it, whoever wrote this Bible, chooses not to include the son in the story of the mother's passing. And by the way, Paul, you know, and I know, and we all know, all of us know, if we were, especially pre-COVID times, imagine you're going to a funeral for John Doe or for Jane Doe. You're going to a funeral for John Doe or for Jane Doe. John Doe is being buried. Jane Doe is being buried. You're at Levine's, you're at Stanetsky's, you're at the temple. And you know that John Doe has an adult child. And the adult child does not show up to his mother's funeral. That's noteworthy. Right? Who's the main person who's supposed to be at a funeral? The main person who's supposed to be at the funeral are children. Right? And
Well,
so
it's usually, I say it's the spouse.
Oh, spouse. Okay, spouse too. But remember, Paul, that a spouse says Kaddish for a spouse for how long?
30 days.
30 days. Yeah.
And who says Kaddish for 11 months or a year?
Children.
Children, right? So Jewish law, halacha, I mean, of course, a spouse losing a spouse is beyond horrible and tragic. But Jewish law says that's the 30-day Kaddish. When a child loses a parent, that's an 11-month or a year Kaddish. That's a whole separate, was it 11 months or a year? That's a separate class. But that's the only one. In any event, right, so it may well be that this is an interpretation, but the interpretation of the interpreter is Isaac's not present. Let me give you just the third silence of Rabbi Sachs, which is that Isaac does not even participate in his own dating life. You know, could you imagine that you have a single child or a single grandchild, and you pick their partner, and they have no say in the partner you pick, right? They just go along, and you say, honey, I found the match for you. And by the way, you've never met this person, and I found this person actually in Iraq who's come here, and I hope you like her, because this is who we're picking for you, right? So take a look on page 6. You know, Abraham said to the senior servant of his household, that's Eliezer, who had charge of all that he owned, put your hand under my thigh. I'll make you swear by the Lord, the God of heaven, the God of earth. You will not take a wife for my son, Isaac, from the daughters of the Canaanites among whom I dwell, but will go to the land of my birth and get a wife for my son, Isaac. So this entire Isaac's wife, Rebecca, he never goes on a date, and he never, you know, he's entirely a passive recipient of the plot that his father, Abraham, and Eliezer, the servant, do. And so Rabbi Sachs argues that Isaac is again not present in his own life. He's not present when he leaves the mountain. He's not present when his mother dies. He's not even present for when he gets married. Now, let me just pause there. And Rabbi Sachs' interpretation is that Isaac has something like a depression that disables him from really living fully. Let me just invite comments, thoughts, questions about this first part of Rabbi Sachs's analysis.
I'm curious if he has a question.
Anybody have a question?
What's your question?
How old is that?
It's irrelevant. If he was married, what difference does
No,
it make?
before that.
Bert, but your question is, how old is Isaac? So we know the answer to that one, actually. It never happens that I know the answer to a question, but that's a question I know the answer to. The Torah says that Isaac gets married at the age of 40. So he's getting up there. He's getting up there. He's a late bloomer. And you know from the context of this third silence that we just read, that Abraham is worried about his son. And in fact, it's more than that. Abraham is introduced as being very old and he's going to die shortly. But he can't die until he makes sure that his son Isaac is partnered. Isaac is not in a good place. I mean, we don't want to leave this world until we know that our children are in a good place. And Abraham can't leave this world until he knows his son is a good place, and his son is not in a good place because his son is all alone, and he wants to find a partner for his son. He's 40 years old, Bert, when he gets married. Connie.
I think for our era, Rabbi Sachs' interpretation can make sense, but I also agree with Paul that there could be another interpretation in another society or another era that thinks differently.
And Connie, dear, what would that other interpretation be? Would you hazard that interpretation for us?
Maybe he went off to fight a war. Maybe he's off studying someplace. Maybe, well, I was thinking of like in Australia when boys go off they have a challenge to go off into the wilderness and prove themselves. I mean,
Okay, so Connie, those are all certainly possible. Maybe he was off fighting a war. Maybe he was off for studying for a year abroad. Who knows, right? But the only thing that I would say that constrains our freedom of interpretation, or should at least be the starting point for our interpretation, is the plain text of the Torah, right? You want your interpretation to at least acknowledge and gesture towards the plain text. And the plain text is that he has been bound for slaughter by his father. His very father bound him, and his very father took a knife, and his very father was going to chop his head off, and at the last minute didn't. So that is, I think all of us would say that is kind of traumatic, to be under the edge of a knife, and especially when it's your father. So you could say he responded to that by fighting a war, or responded to that by doing a year abroad. But and that's possible. But I think Rabbi Sachs's interpretation is plausible, because it feels like a human move to be confused, disoriented, disabled, and depressed when your father took a knife out on you. So anyway, John and then Peter.
I think what you said about anyone can get depressed, and most of us do off and on, is certainly true. However, I don't see Rabbi Sachs' interpretation as you do. The other possible, he simply says that Isaac was away. Why? Isaac may have been just furious at his father for what he had done to him, and stayed away and was estranged, and even so far as not coming back to mourn his mother, or maybe he didn't know about his mother's death or mourned her separately. He disappears. I mean, that's the basic thing of those three passages. But we don't know he's depressed. We know he's had a traumatic incident, and he may simply be very angry and estranged. And so the depression, I think, is your interpretation, which is a very nice one, but it's not the only one.
Oh, I never would say it's the only one. Peter.
I was going to say that same thing, that he was probably angry at his father and maybe angry at his mother for not preventing it. And who knows? And also, wasn't it common then for parents to be matchmakers for their kids, unlike now?
You know, look, it is possible that he's angry at Sarah. I mean, anger is also a plausible read, but it is kind of striking that that he's just not mentioned. But either way, you could say it's anger, you could say it's depression. What's clear is he's not present in these moments where one might expect somebody to be present. So let's go on. So what happens? So he's not present here, and then what happens? And if you take a look at page 8 of my handout, this is the beginning of the recovery of Isaac. Okay, so let me give you a little bit of context here. This is to get this point, and this is the pivot point of the Isaac narrative. From his absence and his silence, whether it's because of depression or anger, right? What happens? So the next scene where we see Isaac is after the binding, and it's after Sarah dies, and it's after Abraham commissions his servant to go find a wife. The Torah records that he comes back from a town called Be'er Lahai Roi. Be'er Lahai Roi. And that's a weird name. And it's a name that we're familiar with in Genesis. And what happens in Be'er Lahai Roi, it's in Genesis 16, is that Hagar, who is the concubine of Abraham, this is in the long season when Sarah cannot get pregnant, and she tells Abraham to have relations with Hagar, and if Hagar gets pregnant, that child will be reckoned to Sarah like her own son. This is Genesis 16. And Abraham and Hagar have relations. Hagar gets pregnant, and you can imagine the emotion and the texture as between Hagar and Sarah. And Sarah is now very, very angry and vengeful. And the Torah says that Sarah mistreats Hagar. And Hagar runs away. And then Genesis 16 has an angel seeing Hagar, who's weeping. Why are you weeping? I'm weeping because my mistress mistreats me. And the angel says to her two things, says to her, you're going to be okay. You're going to have a child, and God's going to take care of this child. And you're going to be the father, you're going to be the mother of a nation. You're going to be okay. And two, go back to Sarah. You have to deal with Sarah. But in the end, this is going to be a good story for you. Go back to Sarah. It's going to be a good story for you. And then the text says the name of this town is Lahai-Roi, God saw me. This is the well where God saw me. So she felt invisible beforehand. She felt invisible and abused by Sarah. And now this is the town where God saw me. And then she goes back. Okay, so Be'er Lahai-Roi is where Hagar, who is very despondent, feeling very invisible, feels seen and hopeful. And Isaac's first return after the binding is he comes from, guess where? Be'er Lahai-Roi. And so what the Midrash does, the Midrash imagines that he's been depressed, or he's been absent, or he's been angry, but he's not been present. And he goes to Be'er Lahai-Roi. And why does he go? He goes to read that his mother has died, and he knows that Abraham loves Hagar. And he goes to get Hagar and Ishmael reconnected with his father, Abraham. And in the very next chapter, Genesis 25, Abraham marries a woman named Keturah, and bam, 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 they have 6 strapping sons. This is in Genesis 25. After Abraham struggled for years to have a baby with Sarah, he marries Keturah, and boom, 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 our 6 sons. And Rashi says that who is Keturah? Keturah is Hagar. And how did Hagar come to be? Hagar came to be with Abraham because Isaac's first move back to life was to go to Be'er Lahai-Roi, the place where Hagar was seen. He sees her and he tries to bring her back. Okay, with that as background, I want to go to page 8 of my handout. This is what Rabbi Sachs says. Okay. The text itself is significant. Isaac had come from Be'er Lahai-Roi. That's the first verse after the binding. What was this place? We have encountered it only once before. It is where the angel appeared to Hagar when pregnant. She fled from Sarah, who was treating her harshly. An ingenious midrash says that when Isaac heard that Abraham had sent his servant to find a wife for him, he said to himself, "Can I live with a wife while my father lives alone? I will go and return Hagar to him." A later text tells us that after Abraham's death, God blessed his son Isaac, who then lived near Be'er Lahai-Roi. On this, the Midrash says that even after his father's death, Isaac lived near Hagar and treated her with respect. So what you have here is I want to just go down two more paragraphs. The message of Be'er Lahai-Roi seems to be that Isaac never forgot how Hagar and her son, his half-brother Ishmael, had been sent away. The Midrash says that Isaac reunited Hagar with Abraham after Sarah's death. The biblical text tells us that Isaac and Ishmael stood together at Abraham's grave. Somehow the divided family was reunited, seemingly at the instigation of Isaac. So this is going to be what Rabbi Sachs argues, which is after Isaac is depressed and removed from life, he does this move of radiating love. And he goes to the place where somebody else who suffered could maybe suffer less, and bring Hagar, who is without Abraham, to Abraham, who is without Hagar and without Sarah. And by loving somebody else, By loving somebody else, Isaac was able to bring himself out of depression. And we have one more piece, which is actually the way the whole analysis of Rabbi Sacks starts. We'll get to that in a minute. But the fulcrum of his argument is that Isaac is not present after the binding, not present after Sarah dies, not present after to get a wife for himself. But when he tries to help somebody else, when he tries to help his father, when he tries to help Hagar, that revives Isaac and brings him back to life. And in a way, that's a through line of all of these different pieces of the presidents, that they're thrown out of their depression when they start radiating their energy outward. So long as they're inward, they're in bed with the quilt over their head. So long as they're inward, they're drinking too much and in the house too much and not in a good place. As soon as they can go outward, each of them in their different ways, that's the beginning of their healing. Let me pause and get any thoughts, comments, or questions from anyone, and then we'll close with the next piece, which is the coup de grace of this whole argument. Questions, thoughts, comments, and feel free also to chat with Sean or in the chat function, and I'll know that you're there. Oh, Annette Miller, thank you so much. If you could unmute Annette. And Annette, you're still muted. If you could unmute.
Okay.
Now you're unmuted. Perfect.
So this is a fantastic story. What I'm curious about is that to me, it seems that Isaac goes back to a place where he feels he is the cause of Hagar being thrown out and the cause of the problem with Ishmael. It's because he was born that the other one is thrown out. Okay, so he has this. It isn't until he can kind of work out that guilt that he's feeling, which had nothing really. He was like a bystander in that. His mother acted a certain way after he was born. So in some way, he has to put those pieces together. I mean, it is true that once you go out to help others, I understand what Sacks is getting at, but there is another story there. It seems to me that he goes back to the place where, like, he is this person that caused all this problem. He caused Hagar to be thrown out. And so Ishmael, I think he works that out. I think he is depressed. I think that anger is a part of, they say that anger is depression. I guess when you're depressed, you're not allowing yourself to feel anger, something like that. So yeah, anger, depression, it's all there, but something happens that he is drawn to go back and make nice and make better something that he caused. He's sort of like closing the circle there. There's something kind of, I never realized that part of the story. So I'm just throwing that into about.
In other words, what I hear you saying, Annette, is it's not just that Isaac started being outward facing and getting out of his own head and living and making a difference on others, but the other on whom he chose to make a difference, he had a history with. So
there's something that he has to work out.
Right. There's a sense of remedy, of tikkun, of repair, of restoration here. Good.
Yes.
Good.
Right.
Esther Greif, you had a comment. Thank you, Annette. Esther Greif, you had a comment.
Yes, I always saw Isaac as traumatized by Ishmael being sent away because it meant his father could give up on one of his sons. Then, of course, the Akedah happened. So it's like a double trauma. But I find symmetry here because here Isaac takes action in the Midrash and goes and finds a spouse for his father, just as we talked about how his father gets one for him. Right. And then the ultimate irony is that the trauma of his brother, of Isaac's brother Ishmael being sent away, then the story doesn't quite end, but Isaac's son is then sent away, one of his. So it just seems sort of ironically symmetrical to me. And Isaac, I always thought of as so passive, but in a way he wasn't. He built up his, his work and his money and so forth. But I think he had an overpowering father, and that left him more silenced.
Nice, Esther. Thank you. Thank you. Any other comments on the Rabbi Sachs's argument to date? Isaac is absent, whether from depression or anger. He begins his emergence by doing this act of kindness, whether it's just helping others or, as Annette points out, remedying a historical trauma in his own family. But once he's able to help his father put Hagar together, he's able to then get married to Rebecca. He's able to be in a place of affirmation of life again. And now our class can begin with the question that most animates Rabbi Sachs. And so look on page 1. This is the question that causes this whole, I think, very astute and very poignant interpretation. And this is from our reading this week, Toldot. And the Torah says, verse 28, the end of page 1, Isaac favored Esau because he had a taste for game, but Rebekah favored Jacob. And the question Rabbi Sachs asks, and it's a really wonderful question, double click on this question, why would Isaac, our holy forefather, the son of Abraham, why would Isaac have preference because a guy was a hunter and brought him venison or brought him a steak, right? Is that really the proving ground that I like steak and you bring me steak? Wouldn't we expect more from a forefather? So I want to show you, and in general, the interpretation of our classical sources is that this whole thing is, to use the Yiddish term, pashnish. The whole thing is inappropriate. It's kind of unsavory. The fact that Isaac would prefer Esau is unsavory. The fact that Isaac would prefer Esau because Esau cooks him steak is unsavory. So take a look on page 2 of the handout. The Talmud in the Tractate Shabbat assumes that this is about Isaac being able to love a wicked child, right? The sages envision a day when God will come to judge the Jewish people for their sins, and Isaac will rise to defend us, even though we're sinful. Why Isaac? Because he will be entitled to say to God, I had a wicked child and I loved him. Can you not do the same? In other words, so one interpretation is the fact that Isaac loves Esau, it's not about the steak. It's about the fact that Isaac has this generosity of heart that he can love an evil child. But you get implicit in all this is there's something inappropriate, unsavory about this affection. And then the other reading is, if you look on page 3, this is Rashi. Rashi is going to take this literally and then do a metaphor with it. It says, Vayehav Yitzchak et Esav ki tzayid b'fiv. Isaac loved Esau because he had, game, he had steak, he had venison in his mouth. He ate of the trappings. And then Rashi says, but its midrashic interpretation is with the mouth of Esau, he would entrap him and trick him with words. That this is Rashi's interpretation, that Isaac is only loving Esau, not because he loves venison, but because what he has in Isaac's mouth is lies and a smear campaign that Esau puts out. In other words, classic exegesis of this verse is unsympathetic. Now comes Rabbi Sachs. And I just love this. Take a look now at page 8 again. Okay. Now Rabbi Sachs is going to put this whole interpretation together. What does all this mean? By all this, the silences, Be'er Lahai Ro'i, and the fact that Isaac loves Esau. What does all this mean? We can only speculate. But if the silences mean something, they suggest that, that even an arrested sacrifice still has a victim. Isaac may not have died physically, but the text seems to make him disappear, literally, through 3 scenes in which his presence was central. He should have been there to greet and be greeted by the 2 servants on his safe return from Mount Moriah. He should have been there to mourn his departed mother, Sarah. He should have been there at least to discuss with his father and his father's servant, his future wife. Isaac did not die on the mountain, but it seems as if something in him did die, only to be revived when he married. The text tells us that Rebekah became his wife and he loved her, and Isaac was comforted after his mother's death. Then, if this is so, then Isaac's love for Esau is simply explained. It is as if Isaac had said, I know what Esau is. He's strong, he's wild, unpredictable, possibly violent. It is impossible that he should be the person entrusted with the covenant and its spiritual demands. But this is my child. I refuse to sacrifice him, as my father almost sacrificed me. I refuse to send him away, as my parents sent Hagar and Ishmael away. My love for my son is unconditional. I do not ignore who or what he is, but I will love him anyway, even if I do not love everything he does, because this is how God loves us, unconditionally, even if he does not love everything we do. I will bless him, I will hold him close, and I believe that one day that love may make him a better person than he might otherwise have been. In this one act of loving Esau, Isaac redeemed the pain of 2 of the most difficult moments in his father Abraham's life, the sending away of Hagar and Ishmael, and the binding of Isaac. I believe that love helps heal both the lover and the loved. I just love Rabbi Sachs. So that, in other words, the reason he loves Isaac is, I'm going to love him anyway. He's different. He's not me. There's no such thing as reproduction, only production. This is my son, and I love him. And he was able. So, in the end, Rabbi Sachs presents you with an Isaac who has a complicated interior life like our New England weather. It's stormy and it's cloudy and it's raining. And then by giving love to Hagar and by giving love to Ishmael and by giving love to Abraham, he's then able to love Esau for who Esau is. And he emerges from his trauma healthy and strong. Thoughts, comments, and questions? Debbie.
I just am somewhat reminded in this story of Joe Biden, who also has 2 sons, whom one could clearly say one is the good son, his son Beau, who had such admirable and incredible qualities, and his son Hunter, who's plagued with all these personal issues. And I was so struck in the debate when of course Trump wanted to bring up the subject of Hunter and try to incriminate him with all of the issues regarding Burisma and other things. And Joe Biden stopped and said, my son, like other people's sons, had a drug problem and he's overcome it. And I just want to say that I'm proud of my son and I love him. So here we have another president who's dealing with so many issues, and he was able to come to the same view that Isaac did, that he has unconditional love for his son. So I thought that was a beautiful moment at that moment, and now I'm being reminded of it.
Debbie, thank you. And by the way, let me just tell you, I can't say this enough. I can tell you when you die what the main grade you'll get reported on in your report card from your children and grandchildren. I can tell you because I've been with 1,000 families over 25 years. If you love your children for who they are, your children will love you. The biggest compliment they can pay is my parent, my mother, my father, my grandparent loved me for who I am. That's the biggest compliment they can pay. And when there are issues, it is because that didn't happen. It is because the parent wanted the kid to be something the kid wasn't and couldn't be. And that just always creates residue. Well, my dad had high standards, or, you know, my dad and I didn't quite click, or et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So I think this ability for unconditional love is just the single most essential quality to determine not only the quality of your relationship while you're living it, but also the legacy that you have. An uncomplicated legacy is built on unconditional love. An uncomplicated legacy is built on unconditional love. Thoughts, comments, questions? Thank you, Debbie. Other ideas people want to share? David Kopelman, and then Annette.
Yeah, that unconditional love is an interesting concept. Often when you read about a murder that takes place and they interview the mother says, my son never would have done it. My son is kind. He's nice to his pet cat. He's a loving son. I don't believe he committed this atrocious murder, even though his fingerprints are on the knife. He may have even made a confession. He had a motive. It's clear. It's absolute, and there's a witness. It's crystal clear that the son committed the murder, and yet the mother refuses to accept that fact. She just says, I love my son. He couldn't have done it. I don't believe it. He's being framed. He didn't do it. So unconditional love, I mean, sometimes it knows no barriers, even in the face of reality.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely true. Annette.
I think that Isaac does his father one better. I think because Isaac experienced what it meant to throw out one child, the child to send Hagar and Ishmael out, he caused and put so much on Isaac, and he caused this big rift that Isaac says, I'm not going to do that. That happened to me. I am not going to this kid needs a lot of work. He's not everything, but if I hold him close, maybe the good will come out. I just think that it has something to do again with what happened to him, that he learned from that. So that was all.
Thank you, Annette. So I want to just bring the Isaac piece back to the LBJ piece in Doris Kearns Goodwin's book. And what's so striking about the LBJ piece, in contrast to Lincoln, Teddy Roosevelt, and FDR, is that the LBJ piece contains two different depressive episodes. It contains the depressive episode of the lost election and the depressive episode of his heart attack. And he responds to each, as you all know, if you've read the chapter, so differently. After the heart attack, after the lost election, he's in self-aggrandizing mode. And after the heart attack, he's in I want to help the vulnerable mode. And so I think what that connects with the Isaac piece, in that it speaks to the fact that if you live, it is inevitable to have New England weather in your soul. It is just inevitable to have New England weather in your soul. And then the question really is, what do we do about it? When we have stormy and cloudy in our soul, what do we do about it? And both LBJ in the second episode and Isaac, as Rabbi Sachs depicts him, provide a model that our depression could be a goad to an ever better version of us. That when we confront pain, that the way that we confront it, learn from it, grow from it, get more resilient from it, could make us a better version of ourselves. It worked for LBJ. It worked for Isaac. May it work for us. So thank you so much, guys. And we will pick up next week with part 3, chapter 9, transformational leadership, Abraham Lincoln and the Emancipation Proclamation. Thank you so much, and we'll see you next Tuesday.
Great. Thank you.
Thanks. Bye.